through life. Lord, we're proud of these things in your Son's most holy name. Amen. Well, we went up to Pulaski for the funeral, and then today, the hospital at Vanderbilt told me that my nephew's coming home tomorrow. So tomorrow, all my family's going to meet my nephew, and we're going to go up in a few weekends after my niece on Sydney's side is born. So we got a busy family right now, I guess you could say. It has been quite a long day. Started this morning in Tennessee at a funeral, and so I'm going to need some participation tonight. And I hope you guys came prepared and very studious because I'm going to enjoy this discussion. So let's start by looking at Father Abraham. We talked a little bit about his faith last week, and one of the things that we made mention of was his faith to leave. This next little bit, we're going to look at his faith to lead his family. So when we look at the faith to leave, one of the things that we made mention of is it wasn't just a geographical moving. It was also a moving away from the gods of his fathers, or moving away from some of the practices that generations who had come before him had practiced. And so not only was it a great show of faith for Abraham to geographically move, but it was a great show of faith for him to commit to serving God and doing the things necessary to serve after God. And Sarah, and for Sarah as well, and for the rest of Abraham's family. But when you look at, we made mention a little bit of Matthew 15 and verse 9 last week. When you look at it, we also have to make a commitment to God to leave. Sometimes we have to leave some of the things that we have done in the past, or maybe our mindsets that we have had in the past. I was talking with somebody just the other day, and one of the things that we made mention of was it's not only important, but it's necessary for a Christian to have confidence, not just in their salvation, but in their beliefs. But at the same time, there's a difference in confidence and being too prideful. Confidence has faith that I believe that what this is truthful, but being too prideful means that I'm not willing to grow, even if I'm shown that this is not true. And that's a fine line, because you want to have confidence. You want to be confident in the understanding that you have of Scripture. You want to be confident in your practice of Scripture. But at the same time, we also have to be mindful of the fact that, just like a lot of things in life, we can be wrong about it. We can make mistakes, and so therefore we have to be willing to learn. And I think that's one of the most beautiful parts about the church itself, is it's this place where you enter into a position where it's a judgment-free zone. You don't have to be right about everything, but we have to continue to seek for the truth, and we have to seek to learn. And so sometimes we're going to see things differently. We might not agree, and that's not a horrible thing. It just means that we're humans and we have different perspectives on life. The important thing is that we seek for unity, and that we do so by seeking for unity and truth. Okay, let's look a little bit more at our faithful Abraham here. Let me make sure I didn't skip anything. I don't think we talked about Nehemiah. We'll get back to it if we hadn't. Let's start in Genesis chapter 12 here. When we look at the faith to lead his family, Abraham was not just called Abraham was not just called on to leave where he had stayed and where he was accustomed to and where his family had been, but now he's required to leave. Lead. See, I told you I was tired. It's going to happen all the time tonight. Now it's a requirement on Abraham to now lead, which means what under the Old Testament law and under the Old Testament belief? Abraham has a lot of responsibility. He is now becoming the spiritual head for everyone who is to follow him. And so there's a great burden that's now placed on Abraham. He's leaving the place of his fathers. He's going to a place where he has no idea currently where that is, just simply told to go. And at the same time, he's doing so with the responsibility of guiding others along this path. Now, when you think about following after somebody, typically, the person who you're following after, you want them to know where they're going. Because if they don't, then guess what? You'll both end up lost. So if you're following after the one who doesn't know where they're going, or maybe the blind leading the blind aspect of things, you both wind up in the ditch kind of thing. You want the person who you're following after to know where you're going. So when we look at this isn't just a great deal of faith by Abraham, but it's also, like Miss Linda Sue mentioned, a great deal of faith by Sarah, but also by the rest of those who follow after him. He has no idea where he's going. He's being told by God to go somewhere, and he'll let him know eventually. But then all these others are now following along with Abraham. Notice, if we will, in Genesis 12 and verse 5. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, and there they came to the land of Canaan, when they came to the land of Canaan. Notice in the little handout here we made mention of, he took them in the path of God, being led by faith. You know, we think about the requirement that is placed on, and that we're going to get to that here in just a minute. When we think about the requirement that is placed on the head of the household, this very same aspect, or this very same requirement is placed on us today as Christians when we're in a position of authority, we're in a position of leadership. To lead, but to do so with great faith. Abraham didn't have to know where he was going when he left, but he knew that God was with him. Okay.
What do we know about Abraham up until this time? Do we know he was a faithful follower of God? Because we're going to have some contradictory information in just a minute when you get to Joshua. So what was special about Abraham or Abram that God chose Abram?
He gave him the most important covenant ever given to anyone other than.
But the covenant hadn't been made yet. That's the thing. So what was special? Mm-hmm.
In Noah's case,
it was, yeah.
But in Abraham's case, in Abram's case, and I just look at the last minute or two, there was no reason other than God chose him.
Maybe for the same reason that he picked people like Saul and David.
I think it can't be anything other than that.
Yeah, he knew. Whether they knew or not, yeah.
I think he knew that, just like the testing of Abraham later.
Yeah.
You see, that wasn't about God.
Yeah.
It was about
Abraham.
And what? It's showing himself, showing his faith with himself.
Yeah.
God knew what his faith, God knew what his potential was. But you know, we don't really see here. There's no reason why, obviously we know what we know.
Yeah. He found favor in the eyes of the Lord because of his faith. Yeah. Yeah.
To the contrary, Abraham had other teaching that he followed.
Yeah.
We'll see that in Joshua, when you read that in Joshua.
Let's also look very quickly kind of on that same note here. Let's look at the next verse here, Genesis 12 and verse 6. One thing that we need to note as well is, where's Jesus in this, by the way? Where's Jesus in all this endeavor? Let's go back in thought for just a moment. Where was Jesus in creation? In the beginning. He was there. He was present. Where? How? Doing what? In the Word. The Word eventually became flesh and dwelt among man. But in creation, He was the Word. Okay, so remember, we stated at the beginning of our study, when we see these moments where God is speaking to someone, what is that an indication of? Jesus being present. Maybe not as we would call Him as Jesus, but being a part of the Godhead, being present. Let's look, I just opened up and it just closed. Excuse me. Let's look at verse 6 here. Abraham passed through, Abraham passed through the land of the place of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At the time, the Canaanites were in the land. Let's keep reading a little bit. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country to the east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. Abram journeyed on, still going toward Negeb. Okay, notice also, notice very quickly at least. Let me make sure I don't miss it. Verse 7. A good little promise is mentioned in verse 7. What's that promise? That land will belong to those who would follow after him, or his ancestors. It's going to take a minute, a few years before that promise comes to fruition, but at the same time, you'll notice that was a promise that was kept. That was something that was made mention of later on. It was kept.
Beginning, some more the beginning of the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15. Jesus is going to come into the world eventually, and so he has to come. God has to have a nation. It starts at a nation with Abraham.
Yeah.
And going back to what Dad said, well, we can only speculate about why God chose him, but God looks on the heart. It's not usually something he chose David. The king. He looks on the heart. And you see later on the kind of person that Abraham turned out to be. He had his faults, like everybody else. But the Bible says in Genesis 22:18, it said, "And thy seed shall all the nations be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." In Hebrews, Romans 4:3 said, "Abraham believed God, and was counted to him for righteousness." It's also found in Galatians 3:6. Anyway, the idea was Abraham believed what God said, and he acted on it. And here's something to think about. God didn't choose a nation. God chose a man. He chose Abraham. And that's who the nation was going to come through. So you see the beginning of the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15, or the continuation of the things that already happened. And as we go through the Old Testament, that's not the Old Testament's all about. The coming of Christ. And God is preparing mankind, preparing the world, so to speak, so that Christ can come. And he starts out with Abraham to be the father of the 12 tribes, basically. And so it comes on down from that. And we can narrow it down as you go back, as you look at the Old Testament. Genesis 4:19, he narrows it down to the tribe of Judah. So the scepter shall not depart from Judah to shallow ones. So that Christ is going to come through Abraham, and he's going to put one of the 12 tribes, particularly one will be Judah. So you look at all that took place in the Old Testament, the United Kingdom, the United Kingdom, and what tribes were left after the kingdom of God? Judah and Benjamin. Why?
Because that's where Jesus was coming from.
They need to be preserved so that Christ can come. And all the rest of them were scattered, but they also came back too, because James talks about those are the dispersion, the 12 tribes. So the 12 tribes still existed. Some have been taken to Assyria. Later on, the others, some being taken to Babylon. Well, where's Babylon? Same place Assyria was. So they're already there. The northern kingdom over there, southern kingdom come later. So they were reunited after Babylon captivity. The one that Jews won't come back. Not everybody can. And I could go on. Sorry.
No. So what JW said, if you couldn't hear him, was a lot. But one of the things I want to make sure that we kind of pinpoint, and sometimes you wish you could put a big poster on the wall so we can remember something. One thing that JW said was, he didn't choose a nation, he chose a man. And the nation came from that man. And so why? Probably because that preconceived thought, or maybe the foreknowledge of what Abraham would grow to be. But then at the same time also, it's a beautiful thought to know that apparently that faith was so good and so strong and so powerful. It was enough to be the foundation of the nation.
Go back to 22:18, he says, "Thy seed shall all nations be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice." Abraham did everything God told him to. Up and offered his son as a sacrifice. It was that faith that was, because it goes back to Romans 4:3. Abraham believed God. He was counted in righteousness. We talk about that. But that's what we
Yeah.
Righteousness, what that meant.
I want us to also notice when he got to the land of Canaan here, and God makes mention of this promise that was to come at a much later date. Let's see, what was it? Verse 7. Notice what the response to that is at the second half of verse 7. Notice what Abraham does. What did he do? Say it louder. I heard somebody say it. He built an altar. Okay? Let's go down a verse or two. From there he moved to the hill country, to the east of Bethel, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he did what? He built an altar. I'm not sure how much faith he was showing before, but at least now it seems like every step of the way he's taking a moment to recognize what God has done for him up to this point. What kind of gesture would be, or what kind of gesture was building an altar to the Lord I'll wake up in a minute. Let me think what that question was. What did it mean? What kind of gesture did it mean? Or what did it mean in his? It was a sacrifice. For what purpose? Well, for safety, some of it, yeah. Worship. It was worship. Okay. Now let's think back to what? I'm sorry.
How did Abraham know to do that?
Obviously learned along the way somewhere. Yeah.
He didn't do it on his own. God told him to do that.
His father was an idolater.
Yeah.
He was an idol. He was also called Father of Faith. By the maiden being the only man in the Bible called a friend of God. Only one.
What we see about Abraham, though, is that even though he was raised in idolatry, as is evident, what James was saying in Joshua 12, about somebody had believed in God as his father. That's the way he was raised up. That's what he did.
Mhm.
But when God spoke to him, he didn't go back.
Yeah.
It was God and only God. We don't
Yeah.
see any example. We see examples of him making mistakes.
Yeah. But it wasn't idolatry.
It wasn't idolatry.
Yeah.
It was always
In the same sense, at least. Yeah.
acknowledging and being obedient to God. So, I don't know whether he was looking for something that he was, for whatever reason, once he knew the truth, he didn't go back on that truth. That one of the qualities God gave us.
Yeah. Yeah, well.
Because that is, I never really realized that, until that time he was raised in it all.
Yeah. So this is probably a new thing for him. So, and to me, with maybe a grasp on that and maybe a better understanding of that, to me that shows all the more to Abraham's side. Raised in idolatry, raised in idol worship and worshiping little g gods, to the point where now you're leaving not just the practice of idolatry, but leaving your kindred and your home country to go follow after this God or the God. And what can we learn from, well, not just from Abraham in general, but what can we learn from Abraham's specific actions and in these little points in his trip? He stops and worships God. How can we apply that to our lives today and grow from it?
God has to come first in our hearts. That's when we've got to thank God and worship Him. Give Him glory for everything.
And let's think about worship for just a moment as well. I mean, we may mention the altar building was a form of worship. Okay, let's go back to our Sunday school. You ready to go back to Sunday school a little bit? All right. What are the acts of worship? We've got singing, we've got teaching, we've got the Lord's Supper, we've got giving. What else do we have? Praying. Okay. When Abraham got to these points, these landmarks, I guess you could say, these checkpoints almost, he recognized the need, whether it was told by God to him specifically to do these things. From what we see, it seems as if it's a voluntary thing. He saw the promise of God. He made an offering to God as a form of worship. So maybe what about in our lives? We come across something that we recognize as God's love for us. Maybe we get to a spiritual, maybe even a physical checkpoint. Should not our same reaction be, in a similar sense to worship God? We should show just as much reverence, just as much thankfulness. One of those things is prayer. You see the great, super easy task of given to us of pray without ceasing. At every time in our lives, always be in prayer, or always have a mindset for prayer. While it's not the act of praying, it is an act of making an offering, which would have included a sense of prayer in it, or even prayer in it. To me, it's almost a direct comparison here. We reach something good within our lives, or maybe even we reach something bad. First person we need to turn to is God. We need to talk to Him. Make an offering unto Him. When we are praying, is that not what we're doing? We're making supplication with God, making an offering unto God. In fact, in order for those of the Old Testament to make supplication, typically they would even find themselves making an offering to God in order to make sure that they're good, and then make supplication with God. Of course, we've had that offer being made, but therefore when we reach those checkpoints, so to speak, I don't think it'd be a bad idea for us to stop and pray. This seems like Abraham is getting to the point, at least, that his mindset is to follow after God, but also to thank God for what He has done for us, or for him. And so I think it would be good for us to maybe do the same. Okay, let's look at 1 Timothy. If you have any thoughts, hold them for just a minute, and we'll get to them in just a second. 1 Timothy 5, and we will begin. Let's go back to verse 3, if you don't mind. 1 Timothy 5, we'll go back to verse 3 a little bit. Honor widows who are truly widows, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, I think I'm in the wrong spot, y'all. I think I put down the wrong verse here, and I just now caught it. Because verse 8 does not say anything new like that. If anyone does not provide for... Oh, no, there we go. Okay, never mind. Keep reading. Or keep going. Started reading a little bit ahead of myself. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even where she lives. Command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he is denied the faith and is worse. There we go. Thank you, Mr. Randy. Than an infidel, or worse than an unbeliever. You look at some descriptions here. What is the hope of an unbeliever? There's no hope for an unbeliever. In fact, there's a promise for unbelievers, and that's eternal separation from God and eternal damnation, eternal punishment, this, that, and the other. So when you look at a phrase like the one who does not take care of his family or provide for his relatives, especially members of his household, notice what it says here. He has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever, worse than an infidel. Now, in the direct context, what's being mentioned here is the difference between a widow and a widow indeed, and the task at hand given to the church versus the task at hand given to the families of the widow. But what you see here is the one who neglects the responsibility they have to their family becomes worse than somebody who does not believe in God at all or does not follow after God. We were talking this morning, and one of the things that we were mentioning of is that great promise of the great commandment, or the greatest commandment. Anybody remember what it is off the top of your head? It's two-part. First is to do what? Love the Lord your God with all your being, with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, this, that, and the other. And the second, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay? You take those two, the reason why they're probably considered to be the greatest is because everything else kind of umbrellas underneath those two. But you look at this task given here in 1 Timothy 5:8 and the task given to those who are at least the relatives of the widow and the widow indeed. To the widow, not the widow indeed. Those who are related to the widow, they have a responsibility, at least the men do, have the responsibility of doing what they can to take care of this individual. Anybody know the difference between the widow and the widow indeed off the top of your head? Okay. Let's rephrase it a little bit. All right? Instead of indeed, maybe we should say in need. Or the widow who has no one to be there for them. A true widow. Nobody. It becomes the responsibility of the family, and they become a widow. It becomes the responsibility of the church, a spiritual family, when there's no family to support that widow. Okay, who has been a Christian here the longest? I want to know this. It's not me, I can tell you that. So you can count me off. We're not going to ask any ages either. Okay. Bobby, how long have you been a Christian? 60 years. Anybody beat 60 years? Okay. I'm not going to ask how long. Never ask a woman. More than 60 years. Okay. How many of you have ever seen a widow indeed being taken care of by the church? It's a pretty rare thing. I personally have never seen it. When we were in school, nobody in my entire class, there were 20 of us nearly, none of us had ever seen it. Luckily, a lot of us had seen a lot of widows who were taken care of by their families, but never seen somebody fully supported by the local congregation. It's a pretty rare thing. But in the event that it's needed, well, guess what? It's needed. And it becomes the responsibility of the church. It's one of those, not necessarily neglected or forgotten commandments, but it's one of those that's very rare. But in the event that it is the case, then it needs to be taken care of. Foley? Mm-hmm. Robert's, okay. Really? Yeah. Wow. Wow, that is absolutely fantastic. Yeah, yes, sir. Yeah. And it's not to say that we're doing anything wrong. It's just I've never seen it. I had never experienced it. You know?
It's probably more about the place we don't
Yeah.
know how blessed we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a nation, as a people. That's not the case all over.
No, it's not.
The case in most of the rest of the world. I think India in particular.
Yeah.
People would be there, go there, and have the orphanages for the kids, but the homes for the others, the widows and stuff. We just don't. Thanks to this, we don't have that need here. Most, there's something somewhere for it. That talks about power, the weapon in its place.
Yeah. Even when you look at it in retrospect, we got a community that's filled with a lot of people under the poverty line, but we're still an incredibly blessed community nonetheless. Not necessarily defined as the greatest commandment, but you'll see two people being mentioned on a regular basis by both Jesus and his disciples that he calls on the church to continually look out for or to care for. Anybody know who those two people are? Widows and orphans. Okay, the entirety of Jesus' ministry was caring for the people who had no one to care for them. Now that came in different fashions and forms. Sometimes it came in the form of widows. Sometimes it came in the form of orphans. But a lot of times it came in the form of people who were cast out from the world, from the rest of society. That even if they were in need, because they might have been considered to be unclean, or because they were considered not to be a part of the right group, they would have been completely cast out. Jesus' ministry was the ministry to those who were in need. He was the ministry to those who were the downtrodden, the ministry to those who were in need, the widows, the orphans, this, that, and the other. And so what does that tell us maybe about our ministry? Even though we are blessed as a country, and maybe that's something that's not as dealt with, maybe that should tell us a little bit of focus about our ministry and outreach to the world is to take care of those who are in need. Now, you could get as broad with that as you could possibly get and say everybody's in need. Everybody's in need of grace, in need of mercy, in need of love. But really, when you get down to it and get into the nitty-gritty and really be honest with ourselves, there's several people even in this community who are in great need. And it's our responsibility to meet those needs. Not those wants or the desires, but the needs kind of thing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of these aspects here. Notice, I just opened 2 Samuel for some reason. Notice in 1 Timothy, kind of interesting, I think, that before you get to this point as a church, you see in chapter 3 some qualifications. Let's notice some of these qualifications really quick, especially one in specific. Let's go down. Let's see. Let's notice chapter 3. We're going to go through verses 1 and 2. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone desires the office of an overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, and what? What does it say? Hospitable. Okay? That's a good purpose to have in your a good qualification to have in your leadership for what purpose? So that they can lead the congregation in a show of hospitality. That's something that we are incredibly blessed here, not just with our elders, but also with our deacons. We have incredibly hospitable people, and not just within those two groups, but as a congregation, an incredibly hospitable group of people. And, we think about the little things that go a long way and the little things that show our love of Jesus and show our love for others. Each of those things is something that praises and honors God. We don't just send a card because it makes me feel better, it makes you feel better. We send a card because it glorifies God and it lifts His name on high. Our actions, similar to that of Abraham's, must always be in reverence to showing glory to God, and at the same time must also be in constant worship of our Master. And I'll get off on a rabbit hole in that one if we don't stop. Okay, any thoughts on those two verses before we go on a little bit? Okay, notice in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, who is the charge given to there in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8? I'll give you a hint. Okay, it was a specific gender, and it wasn't female. Okay, it was the men. The thing was placed on the men. But look also at a description given in Proverbs 31, specifically here in verse 27. She looks well to the ways of her household. She does not eat bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. When we looked at 1 Timothy in school, and we looked at the idea of the widow indeed, we immediately followed it with the study of Proverbs 31. And we talked about how the woman of Proverbs 31 lived a lifetime of service, and in return, when she could no longer care for herself, was repaid with that service from others. It's this happy combination, this happy harmony, I guess you could say. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. It truly, I almost feel bad sometimes because I think every Ladies' Day for the past 20 years has probably had Proverbs 31 in it, but I think it's for a good reason, because it is such a good description of someone who serves after God and the way that she used her role. And remember, this is Solomon's writing, and remember who he's talking about here. But she used her role as a way of glorifying God in her life. And really, when it boils down to it, Abraham was set to do the same, David was set to do the same, we're all set to do the same, to use where we're at in our position to glorify God. She did so. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Remember the
Yes, sir.
first thing you said about that kind of woman?
I'm sorry?
Remember the first thing you said about that kind of woman?
I don't remember off the top of my head. No, sir.
Hard to find.
Hard to find. Yes, sir. Hard to find.
Some of these girls, or whatever you want to call them, during this day and time, it's hard to find young ladies like that. They all.
And her husband appreciated her too.
He did. He did. Notice in verse 10 of Proverbs 31, an excellent wife who can find, she is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts in her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and the works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from afar. She rises while it is yet night. She provides food for her household and portions for her maidens. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands she plants a vineyard. She dresses herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household are clothed in scarlet. She makes bed coverings for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and she delivers sashes to the merchant. Strength and dignity are her clothing. She laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and teaching of kindness is in her own tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household, and she does not eat of the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, beauty is vain. A woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. Okay, there's one thing I want us to point out here. It has nothing to do with Abraham here, kind of. But one thing I want us to point out here. Notice something about this Proverbs woman. Look at verse 16. Okay, verse 16, and let's couple it also with, let's see.
I see in the whole picture, she's a worker.
Yeah.
Everything about her husband's great because of what he does.
Let's look at verse 16 and couple it with verse 23. Let's read verse 23 first, okay? Where's the husband? Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. What does that say about the husband? To be known in the gates and to be known by the elders in the land. What does that mean? That's Bible talk for he's a leader. Okay? Where would business have been done? At the gates. He's a noble man amongst the elders or amongst the leaders. He's a noble man. But notice about verse 16. Notice what is said of her in verse 16. She considers a field and buys it. Okay. well, at the same time, it's also a difference in the times for her as well.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You know, women today, I don't think would buy something like that without the husband.
Well, even for that time though, remember, the husband is at the gates, but what is she doing? She's doing business. This is a woman doing business. Okay, was this typical or not typical?
Lydia was,
I'll give you a hint, it's not typical.
Lydia was the son of the prophet.
Yes. But notice, she worked for what she had, and she used it to take care of the needy and the poor. She used it to take care of her family. Her family never went hungry. Those around her never went hungry. They never went without clothes. They were always warm. She was blessed. She honored her husband by her blessings, by the things that she had labored for. And at the same time, you look at all these descriptions and you'll notice that the way that it is described, especially here in the last few verses, verse 30 specifically. Charm is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. This woman has a life of servitude, a heart willing to seek after what is right and do what is right and to work for what she has. And at the same time, notice what it says that she deserves. To be praised. Okay? Husband, I think that might be a little hint for us as well. I think it's taught at ladies' days a lot in Proverbs 31, but men, we got to pay attention to it as well. The labor cannot go unnoticed. Something to be praised. Yes, sir.
What was the woman made for? Me, man, what?
Help me.
That's a tremendous role. That's the reason God made her.
He trusted her so
Most
much.
men
He did.
do about help.
Anything he had was hers, so what resources she needed to do her work.
Me and Mr. Dell and Mr. Stay have had a million talks probably already about this topic, about we are who we are today and we are where we are today because of those who stand next to us. And, you know, it's truly great not just to have good men who lead in this congregation, but the example that the women of this congregation set for some of the younger ladies is absolutely astounding. And I applaud you for it.
It said, man's work from the sun up, sun down, the woman's work.
Miss Sill said, amen.
Not only did she buy
Man
the
wasn't
field,
complete, man wasn't complete without woman. It doesn't say the same thing about woman.
Yeah, that is very true. Yeah. Now, wives, y'all don't get too excited about that. Yeah.
God wasn't pleased, he wasn't happy with just Adam. He was incomplete, it took the two. So, you know, there's not one less than the other. They have different roles. In this age that we're living in, this generation that we're trying to teach our battle, unfortunately,
Yeah.
they're trying their best to take that away. And they were equal as in the same, and we're not equal in that as in the same. We're not supposed to. It's an insult to say that for women and for men, for that matter. But we have to teach our children that concept for sure, more and more now than we ever had to. That we are different. We're different for a reason. God made us different so that we can complete them.
Somebody had something back here, Miss Patsy.
Not only was she buying land, and for 24, she was making garments and selling.
Yeah, she had her own business.
she grew up in what she needed in purple.
Scarlet.
And all that kind of stuff too. Got
You know, a cynic might say that she's buying land and selling garments because her husband's sitting there talking with us.
And you probably wouldn't be wrong either.
The reality of it was the men were at war,
Yeah.
and that was a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
That wasn't terribly unknown. Women had to learn.
But there was a great deal of trust in doing so. All right, Miss JW, you got 3 seconds to say what you're going to say.
Well, I was just going to talk about the silk and the purple.
Yeah.
Purple is often referred to as royal purple because it was so outrageously expensive in those days. Of course, now it's synthetic dye.
Yeah.
Back then, they had different ones with
Specific places, and it had to be shipped. And
it took a lot of those little slaves to make them out. The purple dye. Very, very expensive. So the fact that she had silk and purple shows that she was very industrious.
yeah.
And the Lord's.
Well, if you'll remember, after woman was created within the garden, they were both given the task of having dominion over creation. They were both given tasks that allowed for them to be, you don't want to say co-workers necessarily, but that's what they were. They worked together, worked side by side. Like Mr. Dale said, I want to make sure everybody hears this because I want to make sure, because it's a really good saying. When God looked at man, he knew that he was incomplete without woman. But he didn't look at woman and say the same thing. So,
So now it's finished.
it is finished. That's right.
The man was completely.
He saw that it was very good, and he said that it was complete. It was finished.
The man was not complete without a woman, so that later on, the man is finished.
I'm not repeating that. You can ask JW. Listen, when I say it's live streamed, I'm not having that on record.